So what if I told you that the origin story of Islam, I mean, the literal moment, the religion went from just a handful of persecuted people to a real functioning community, relied entirely on the protection of a Christian king.
Hmm.
And then what if I followed that up by saying the religion's political foundation was built in a predominantly Jewish city, mostly thanks to a partnership with Jewish tribes?
I'd say that sounds like a version of history that conveniently gets left out of the modern news cycle.
Right.
But it raises a fascinating point right away. The story of Islam's survival isn't this, isolationist story. It's fundamentally a story about interfaith reliance.
That is exactly the angle we are digging into today. We're looking at a stack of sources, some sermons, some historical analyses, titled Lessons from the Hijra and the Hijra, a foundation of interfaith sanctuary and pluralism.
And Hijra is a word most people have probably heard.
Sure, they hear Hijra, they think Islamic calendar. It's the migration that starts the clock.
622 CE. That's the standard date everyone kind of memorizes.
But our sources are arguing that just, seeing it as a date on a calendar completely misses the point. In fact, the Hijra, it actually happened twice.
Wow. Okay.
And these two migrations, they establish a blueprint, really a precedent for religious pluralism, for civic duty, and specifically for the protection of refugees that just feels incredibly relevant right now.
It's not just ancient history then. It's more like a case study in how different communities can, well, manage to live together without killing each other.
So let's unpack this. We have to go back to the beginning to really get why they had to leave in the first place. The sources paint a pretty horrific picture of Makkah around 615 CE.
It was grim. You have the Prophet Muhammad and this small group of early followers, and they are a persecuted minority in every sense of the word.
And when the sources say persecuted, they don't mean like mean tweets?
No. We are talking physical torture, public
Right.
beatings, and eventually a total social and economic boycott. People were being killed just for saying, Allah is our Lord.
Okay, so put yourself in that situation. You're the leader of this group. You're watching your people get crushed. The logical move, historically, is to find a hideout.
Right. A cave in the desert, maybe. Or you send them to a friendly Arab tribe nearby that owes you a favor. That would be the standard tribal play.
Protect your own kind.
Exactly.
But the prophet does something completely counterintuitive here, and this is where the sources really highlight his strategic thinking. He tells his followers to leave Arabia entirely.
Okay.
He points them across the Red Sea toward Abyssinia, what we call modern-day Ethiopia.
Which is a massive risk. You're sending your most vulnerable people across a sea to a continent they don't know, a culture they don't share.
And crucially, Abyssinia isn't Muslim. It's not even pagan Arab. It's a devout Christian kingdom.
This is the part that always gets me. The prophet's reasoning, according to the sources, is, well, it's profound.
Yeah.
He describes the ruler there, the Negus, or Najashi in Arabic, as a Christian king under whom no one is oppressed.
But let me play devil's advocate for a second. The prophet's establishing a new faith, one that, claims to correct previous errors. So why send his followers to a staunchly Christian kingdom? Wasn't there a risk they'd just be converted?
Or that the king would just hand them back to the Quraysh to keep trade relations smooth.
Exactly.
That's the strategic brilliance the sources point to. The prophet saw Christianity not as an enemy, but more like a sibling faith. It was closer to Islam than the idol-worshipping paganism of Makkah.
So he wasn't looking for theological agreement?
No, he was looking for ethical alignment. He gambled that a just Christian was a much safer bet than an unjust relative.
So about a dozen men and women make this trek, and the sources mention this was an escape. They slip out at night, they head to the coast, they find a boat. I mean, if the Quraysh catch them, they're dead.
It's a desperate refugee crisis. They arrive in Aksum with literally nothing. No money, no political leverage. They're throwing themselves entirely on the moral character of this king.
And the drama just ramps up from there because the Quraysh, the ruling tribe in Makkah, they don't just let this go. They send these high-level emissaries to the king with, expensive gifts, bribes, really.
Demanding he deport these rebels.
And this leads to this incredible courtroom drama scene. You have the Quraysh emissaries telling the king, look, these people are troublemakers. They've abandoned our religion. They've split our families. Send them back. The political pressure must have been immense.
Oh, for sure. Just say yes and keep your trade partners happy.
But the king, he turns to the Muslims and asks for their defense. And this sets up one of the most famous speeches in Islamic history from Jafar ibn Abi Talib. I have the text here, and what strikes me is that Jafar doesn't start with theology.
He reads the room perfectly.
He starts with sociology. He says, "O king, we were a people in a state of ignorance and immorality. We mistreated our neighbors. The strong among us exploited the weak." He's painting a picture of just chaos.
He's contrasting the lawlessness of Makkah with the order of the king's court. Very smart.
Then he pivots. He says the prophet taught them truth, mercy, and this is key to honor our trusts and respect the rights of neighbors. And then he drops the hammer. "When they oppressed us beyond limit, we fled to your country, choosing you above others, hoping that here we would find justice."
Choosing you above others? That's a diplomatic masterstroke, but it also sounds sincere. He's framing their presence as a testament to the king's own reputation.
So then the king asks the million-dollar question. Do you have anything your prophet brought from God? Now, if I'm Jafar, maybe I pick a verse about, fighting evil or the oneness of God.
Something assertive.
Right.
Yeah.
But he recites Surah Maryam, the chapter of the Quran about Mary and Jesus.
Wow. That's incredibly bold. He recites the Quranic account of the virgin birth right there in the Christian court. He's basically saying, we love who you love. We honor who you honor.
And the sources describe the king and his bishops actually weeping when they hear this. They recognize the common source.
It resonated.
And the king's reaction is just decisive. He refuses the bribes. He tells the Muslims, you have complete freedom. The source calls this the birth of freedom of belief for Muslims.
It really was. And if you connect this to the bigger picture, it proves that from day one, Islam survived because of the protection of a Christian. The religion didn't survive in a vacuum. It survived in a sanctuary provided by another faith.
So that first migration proved coexistence was possible. But Abyssinia was a refuge. It wasn't a home. They were guests.
And meanwhile, back in Makkah, things were just getting worse. The persecution had gone on for 13 years. The prophet himself was barely surviving assassination attempts.
Right. The status quo was untenable. They needed more than a hideout. They needed a base, a place to actually build a society.
Which brings us to the second migration, the big one that starts the calendar.
In 622 CE, the prophet migrates to Yathrib, which we now know as Medina. Now, I always pictured Medina as this sort of empty slate, broad desert, a few palm trees, and the Muslims show up and start from scratch.
That's a common misconception. Medina was actually a bustling agricultural oasis. And crucially, it was extremely diverse.
Not just Arab tribes.
Not at all. It was inhabited by two major Arab tribes, the Aus and Khazraj, who were constantly fighting, but also three major Jewish tribes, Banu Qainuqa, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza.
So the city was effectively a collection of forts and farms with a very strong Jewish cultural presence.
Predominantly Jewish in terms of, economic infrastructure and theology, yeah.
So the prophet arrives. He's not a king conquering a city. He's actually been invited in as a mediator to stop the civil war between the Arab tribes.
And what does he do? He drafts a document?
The Sahifat al-Medina, the Constitution of Medina.
Right.
Now, the sources describe this as one of history's earliest written constitutions. But is that just hype? I mean, how does it compare to, say, the Magna Carta or Roman law?
Well, it predates the Magna Carta by 6 centuries.
Yep.
And it's different from Roman law because it's a social contract between distinct groups. Before this, Arabia operated on tribal law-blood feuds. You kill my guy, I kill your guy.
Vengeance.
Total vengeance. The Constitution of Medina replaced that with the rule of law. It established a state where the government, not the tribe, had the authority to resolve disputes.
And what makes it so revolutionary for our discussion is how it handled that diversity we just mentioned. This wasn't a theocracy where minorities were just tolerated.
Or second-class citizens. No, it created a political partnership.
I want to read this clause because it blew my mind. The document says, the Jews of Banu Auf are one community, one ummah with the believers. The Jews have their religion and the Muslims have theirs.
That is massive. That word ummah is usually reserved just for the Muslim community today. But here, in the founding political document of Islam, the prophet includes the Jewish tribes within the political ummah. They are partners in the state.
And it wasn't just live and let live. It was a mutual defense pact, right?
Exactly. The Constitution stated that if Medina was attacked, Jews and Muslims would defend it together. They shared the cost of war. They shared the responsibility of civic safety. It was a model of what one source calls covenantal pluralism.
And the sources list all these specific ways the prophet honored the Jewish community to build that trust. For example, for the first 16 or 17 months in Medina, the Muslims didn't pray facing Mecca,
No, they prayed facing Jerusalem, Al-Quds.
which is the ultimate symbolic connection. You're physically orienting your worship toward the same sanctuary as your Jewish neighbors.
A huge sign of respect.
And then there's the fasting. The prophet arrived and saw the Jews fasting for Yom Kippur. When he asked why, they told him it was the day God saved Moses from Pharaoh.
And the prophet's response was, "We are closer to Moses than you are," meaning we honor him just as much.
And he instructed the Muslims to fast in solidarity. That became the fast of Ashura.
He even gave permission to eat kosher food. And there's this heavy quote in the sources where the prophet warns his followers, "Whoever wrongs a person under covenant," meaning a non-Muslim protected by this treaty, "will not smell the fragrance of paradise."
That is a stark warning, but we have to be real about this. It didn't end in a fairy tale. A few years later, there is war, and those specific Jewish tribes are expelled or punished.
Yes. And critics often point to that to say, see, coexistence failed. This constitution was just paper.
Right.
But that's the easy reading.
Yeah.
The sources argue we need to look closer. The breakdown wasn't because of theology. The Constitution wasn't scrapped because the prophet decided he didn't like Jews anymore. The alliance broke because of specific acts of political treason during wartime.
So the argument is that the conflict was geopolitical, not religious persecution.
Precisely. The sources emphasize that the Constitution itself remains the model. The later conflict was a breach of the treaty, but the principle established at the start, that you can have a multi-faith state where Jews and Muslims are one political community, that remains valid.
It showed what is possible when the covenant is honored.
Yep.
So we have the first migration to a Christian sanctuary based on justice, the second to a Jewish partnership based on a constitution. What does this all mean for us today?
This is the so what moment.
Right, because our mission statement here is to see how this resonates in our polarized world.
The sources argue that we need to adopt a Hijra mindset. And for Muslims specifically, or really any minority group, that mindset has two sides: the muhajir, the refugee, and the ansar, the helper.
Okay, let's start with the refugee.
The sources argue Muslims should have this deep, visceral empathy for refugees. And why? Because their prophet was a refugee. He was forced out of his home. He had to cross deserts to find safety. When you see a family at the border or someone fleeing a war zone, that is the Hijra story playing out in real time.
But then you have the other side, the Ansar, the helpers. In Medina, these weren't people who just, tweeted support.
No, they literally split their homes in half to house the refugees. It was radical hospitality. The lesson there is that you have a duty to be the helper. The sources talk about volunteering, supporting resettlement agencies, advocating for humane immigration policies. It's not just a nice thing to do. It's a religious obligation modeled on the faith's founding moment. If you aren't the refugee, you must be the helper. There's no third option.
There's also this idea of civic engagement. One of the articles uses this great analogy about the prophet Joseph Yusuf.
Yeah, Yusuf served in the Egyptian government. He wasn't Egyptian, he wasn't of their religion, but he served the society to save it from famine. The analogy is that modern Muslims should be fully Muslim and fully American, or whatever their nationality is. Contributing to society is an act of faith.
You don't isolate yourself, you improve the neighborhood.
Right, and that includes protecting everyone, not just your own.
I found this verse cited in the source fascinating. It's from Quran chapter 22, verse 40.
That is a crucial verse. It explains why God allows defense or fighting, and it lists who needs to be protected: monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques.
Notice the order there. Mosques are listed last.
Exactly. The source highlights that priority. It implies a duty for Muslims to protect the places of worship of others. If a synagogue is under threat, the Hijra mindset says a Muslim should be standing guard.
That is a powerful image, and it leads into the antidote to Islamophobia that the sources suggest. It's not just about PR campaigns.
No, it's about knowing one another. Quran 49.13. We made you into peoples and tribes so that you may know one another. The source argues that prejudice survives in isolation. The early Muslims won over hearts, the Christian king, the people of Medina, through their character and engagement. You dismantle stereotypes by being a good neighbor.
Before we wrap up, there's one last type of migration the sources mention, and this one is a bit of a plot twist. It suggests that even if you never leave your hometown, you are still expected to perform a hijra.
The Hijrat al-Qalb, the migration of the heart.
How does that work?
It comes from a teaching where the prophet defined a true migrant not just as someone who travels, but as one who leaves behind what Allah has forbidden.
So it's redefining migration from a physical act to a moral one.
Exactly. And this bridges the gap between the history we just discussed and our daily lives. You perform a hijra by migrating from hate to justice, from greed to generosity, from sin to obedience.
From isolation to partnership.
Yes, in a polarized world, the hardest migration isn't crossing a border, it's crossing the divide between us and them. It's migrating away from the comfort of your own tribal bubble to actually engage with someone different. That is the internal hijra.
And that brings us full circle. We started by asking about the origin story of Islam.
And I think the sources have shown that the hijra isn't just a trip from point A to point B. It's a story where the survival of the faith depended on a Christian king's justice. Its political foundation depended on a constitution with Jewish tribes.
It really challenges the narrative we hear so often today, that religions are these competing fortresses that have always been at war.
That's the narrative of conflict. The hijra offers a narrative of covenant. It shows that justice is a universal human value, not a tribal one. The prophet didn't say, go to the Abyssinian king because he's Muslim. He said, go to him because he's just.
And that distinction, it changes everything. It asks us to look for allies based on values, not just labels.
It does.
So here's the final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. We've looked at how the prophet found refuge under a Christian king and built a society with Jewish partners. In our world today, we talk so much about borders and security and walls, but the question the sources leave us with is this. Are we building sanctuaries, or are we just building taller walls?
And on a personal level, that migration of the heart is available to everyone, religious or not. So what is the thing, the prejudice, the habit, the fear that you need to migrate away from today?
That's it for this deep dive into the Hijra. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next journey.